Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for coming out this lunchtime. I'm putting some PowerPoint slides over here, which I'll be speaking to as I go through. So if we could have the first slide. So this is basically just going to take us through the paper, its main findings, the main things that it was saying, and then hopefully will provide, therefore, a framework for our discussion. So the aim of the paper, as I've put on here, was to really answer what citizenship in Britain can mean in the 21st century and why Christians can, and perhaps even should, embrace the vision that is being proposed. So essentially it's asking the question of what it means to belong in the sense of particularly a national identity in this case, but also more widely the nature of belonging. We have moved from a subject status in Britain in a relatively short period of time to a citizenship status. And all that is happening while the world has been very rapidly changing around us, and the UK itself has been changing very rapidly. So what does it mean, therefore, in this new, what we call the globalised era? What does it mean to be as part of this contractual relationship, the citizen relationship, rather than a purely subject relationship? So, firstly, I sort of looked at the debate around fundamental British values. This is a topic that has been discussed much and has really been on the political agenda or been highlighted in the political agenda, particularly since the 7/7 attack, where, of course, it was homegrown terrorists who were those who were behind both the plot and indeed carrying out of the plot as well. But in terms purely of the roots of where it was first used, it was Lord Carlisle who was doing a policy review into the Prevent programme back in 2011, who really used that term, the fundamental British values. And he said, and he used it in the context of acknowledging the fact that those who carried out the 7/7 attacks, and of course we've had a number of attacks since, that seem to not aspire to living in Britain in the way that perhaps it would have been generally understood in the past. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. And his remedy, as he saw it, was the instruction of fundamental British values inculcated through citizenship, but also through history and so on as well. However, that being said, it's an issue that it really had its roots going back to the age of empire. Linda Coley, the historian who wrote the book Britain, Forging of a Nation, which came out in 1997, so just as the Blairite government came in, was asked to give a talk in Downing Street in which she was asked sort of what it meant, if you like, to be British from her research. And she talked about the fact that really Britain was established as an identity, if you like, against Frenchness, but also in relation to the Napoleonic armies. The British army that fought against Napoleon drew people from all over the country and brought them together in a way that hadn't really been seen in Britain before. So there was, if you like, it was a kind of anti-identity. But also she highlighted the fact that Protestantism had been at the core also of what it meant to be British as well. And with the loss of empire in the, well, particularly the 1960s, Britain sought to disown its colonial past, but never really found an answer to actually what it wanted to stand for in a new age. And that was partly covered for a while during the Cold War, but since the end of the Cold War, it has really been searching for the answer to what that is. What is Britain to be, or indeed any other European nation who are also coming out of its colonial era? So the lack of, there was for a long time a lack of engagement on what it meant to be British. So you had hints at it, and I put up there the famous Tebbit test. Now Lord Tebbit complained about the fact that when England were playing cricket against another country, quite often some people in the crowd who were British, had British passports or citizenship, were actually cheering for the other side. And this became derogatorily known as the Tebbit test. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, in the wake of the 7/7 bombings, both talked about fundamental British values in response to the homegrown threat, as I've already mentioned. But it was also the period of multiculturalism, and those such as Tariq Maulud had been advocates for a new kind of globalized understanding of what it meant to be a citizen, not just of the UK, but of any given country. And I've put up there sort of Maulud versus Casey. The Casey review in 2016 really argued that multiculturalism as an ideology had failed because it was not robust enough to stand up to the desires amongst some Muslims particularly to separate themselves from what might be termed mainstream British society. So and disassociate themselves from the pluralist or secular public square and retreat into segregationism. Have the next slide. So really, both, in fact, during the period of the empire and ever since, there's been two approaches to try and bring very different and disparate communities all living on the same island together. The British approach historically has been rather pragmatic, one of integration. And integrationist policy really sought to encourage people to interact with one another, to share common space, and to encourage sort of intra-community engagement as a way of bringing people together. Against that, you had the French model, the assimilationist model, which I've sort of termed here ingrained idealism. But really the notion that there was a very fixed notion of what, say, French identity was and is, and that anybody who chose to come and live in France had to conform to that identity. So two very different approaches, and as I've highlighted there, I would say that neither has been completely successful. Again, we've seen plenty of examples of the problems that France has had with its North African Muslim populations, and we've had plenty of examples of problems with predominantly South Asian Muslim background people in this country, but also other sort of social issues aside from the sort of terrorism side as well. So neither has been necessarily a useful policy. On the one hand, I would say that integration has really offered nothing to attract people to a particular ideal, a particular notion, drawing people in to something that they wish to belong to. Whereas assimilation perhaps goes the other way and tries to force people into a particular model, leaving really very little choice, at least theoretically. I put down a couple of studies, the Cantwell and Kaufman and British Social Attitudes surveys, and they both highlight the fact that the Cantwell and Kaufman study highlights the fact that actually we're very isolated as peoples. So there is, although there is a desire for integration, actually we live in a very individualist society. I'm sure I don't need to say that in one sense, but it just highlights the notion that if you're trying to build community, it's therefore very difficult in a society which is orientated entirely towards the individual and the individual's relationship to the state or any other institution. And the British Social Attitude Surveys showed in 2003 and 2013 that there had been quite an interesting increase in the desire to associate as British and to self-identify as British over that period. So there was, if you like, an aspiration for belonging, even in a globalized world. So the solution that I was proposing was in what I've termed invested citizenship. And really it's the idea that rather than seeking to impose some kind of top-down solution, that actually we encourage community development, not just in relation to the big society, which of course the coalition government sought to institute, which was primarily about volunteerism, but actually to build narratives, or build a narrative about who Britain is. I used to be a history teacher myself, both in the UK and indeed overseas, secondary school history teacher. And it was very clear, very clear that actually whilst the history curriculum was very good in many ways at inculcating technique as far as research and so on is concerned, it actually did not deliver any sense of narrative about what Britain was and why Britain is as it is. And so I recalled the importance of the biblical principle of memory and how important memory was. And it made me realize that actually we've really, over a period of 40 years or so, almost consciously rejected the notion of remembering or memory and narrative as part of our identity. So really it's the invested citizenship is really built on two things. Have the next slide. That I think come out of a biblical construct. So obligation and gratitude. So obligation, I would say that Apostle Paul, Peter and Titus all talked about the Christians' relationship to government, and of course they were writing in a period of time where their government was very often not just, and yet they still talked about the importance of the Christians' obligation to loyalty to their to those in charge of them, but also their desire not necessarily to blind obedience, but to respond positively to loyalty and citizenship claims that were made upon them. I put down there the example of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego from Daniel 3 is one example where the government was not adhered to, the rulings, decrees were not adhered to. So we're not talking about blind obedience, but we are talking about the idea of a general obligation to to be loyal to those in government. I also quote Bruce Winter's book, Seeking the Welfare of the City, which highlights Jeremiah 29, the idea that actually if the whole society prospers, then Christians or God's people prosper along with it. So Christians have an investment to be made as far as their government is concerned. They have something which, put in crass terms, that they get out of it as well if things are going well in society. And that feeds into the notion of the politia, the notion of the public space and responsibility into that. And I've highlighted there Oliver O'Donovan as well. His basic argument was that British Christians have less reason to feel a tension between faith and state than many others in other parts of the world. Part of the research that I've done is on religious persecution of Christians in other parts of the world. And it's very clear that as Christians, particularly in the UK and the US, we've had it pretty easy, really, over the past 300 years or so. So we have a lot of reason to be grateful. Philip, could you do this? And then also gratitude. So this is in many ways the same as, this wouldn't just be true of Christians, I'd say it would be true of the population at large, but you have the notion that our freedoms have been won at a cost. I have an ancestor who fought and died in the English Civil War, which of course was at least partly about ensuring that the king could not overreach his power. And we have liberties which we take for granted, I think, in many cases, but actually have been hard fought and hard won. And of course we can look to things like the Second World War in defence of those freedoms as well. So there's a sort of natural gratitude which I think it should be not just part of our own or specifically Christian mentality, but actually would be true of all citizens. And then secondly, religious freedom. I put down there publication Under Caesar's Sword, which highlighted the fact that Christians in many parts of the world are not free at all, and they've responded in different ways, but the fact is that they live, if you like, under pressure because of their faith. And Kettle was one who highlighted, I think it's Stephen is his first name, that state religion usually means higher persecution of Christians. We have, in one sense, a state religion, insofar as we have an established church, and yet there is not the same kind of persecution. Now, of course, I'm at the college I'm at in Oxford is a Baptist college, and they are at pains to highlight the fact that Baptists were persecuted for some time in this country, as were Catholics and others. But the fact is that, particularly if you're talking about today, we have very little reason to complain. So, conclusions. So what I'm arguing is that there is needs to be a shared gratitude at national level, specifically and deliberately indoctrinated. I know we don't like those terms generally, but I think there is a need to re-establish the nature of what it is that we have, the value, if you like, of what we have. I don't think that either the integration or the assimilation offer actually is a necessary remedy. And it seems to me that there is actually good reason to believe that there is a thirst, if you like, to belong more closely. I've quoted Clothier and Barrett, their study in 2012. They did a study on fundamental British values, and in contrast to the Ofsted ones, they were actually remarkably specific. Their findings were very specific, so it included things like a value on honesty, of accountability, integrity in public life, those kinds of things, and quite a few others. Whereas the Ofsted definition of fundamental British values were rather generic, and I think you'd be hard pushed to find a single democratic nation that didn't have pretty much the same kind of values. So I would say that Christians, I would argue, should have no problem with the concept of this invested citizenship. And I'd also like to highlight that I don't think this is a prescription for turning inwards. So we've had the Brexit vote, and a lot of people have argued, perhaps not unjustly, that this is Britain sort of perhaps turning in on itself and sort of rejecting the whole notion of globalization or being connected and being basically disinterested in the rest of the world. And I would say that invested citizenship certainly is not that. Coming out of my experiences, I lived overseas for some time, and I met a lot of what I term third culture kids, which I put down there. Third culture kids are people who can't answer the question, where do you come from? And it seemed to me that if we are to engage with the world effectively and confidently as British people, or indeed whatever background, you actually need to know where you've come from. You need to be well rooted in order to engage confidently and openly with others. And I think this is what's been missed from the debate. So in the desire for to have a global and outward looking people, that actually we assume that that means we only highlight what David Goodhart called the anywhere notion rather than the somewhere concept. And somewhere involves rootedness. So to me, you need to know where you come from in order to be able to step out into the world more confidently. And in the idea of invested citizenship, I think, enables us to do that. I put down here, I think we've raised at least 2 generations of global third culture kids. So people who enjoy going around the world and confidently sort of be in different places, but actually don't necessarily have a sense of where they have come from. And actually I think that is something of a problem going forward, because if you don't value what you have and where you've come from, then perhaps you're not alive to some of the threats that may come against you in terms of what are the potential ideologies that might seek to undermine the values that we have. So invested citizenship is a long-term strategy. I think we need a long-term strategy rather than a short-term political solution, but we have to start somewhere, and I'm suggesting that this is the place. Thank you very much.